We have been in the manual. That's been our sermon series throughout the summer. It's a deep dive into the book of Ephesians. And we're coming near to the end of our study in the manual. And I don't know about you, but whenever I've opened up a manual trying to figure out how to understand an appliance that we have or some other type of machinery in our home, in the back is an appendix. And often in the appendix, there's even some second or third appendixes which talk about items that are brought up by the manual but aren't focused directly in on it. And that's one for today. Our topic today is, does the Bible condone slavery? Thank you, Pastor Cross, for giving this to me. Oofda. That's a word for this one. What topic is as much a shame on the history of not just humanity, but specifically for the United States? It's often looked at as the original sin of the United States of America. The fact that here we are, a nation that's founded on freedom and liberty, and yet we practiced slavery. But truth be told, slavery is as old as humanity. It goes all the way back to the beginning, and every nation, every society, everywhere has practiced slavery up until about 150 years ago. Maybe you noticed the song that you sang, Amazing Grace. About the same time that was written, it was written by a famous abolitionist in England. And it was right around that time that the first nation in history outlawed slavery. That was Great Britain around 1830. And then the country that followed that very shortly after was France. And then thirdly, you may not know this, we in the United States were the third nation to outlaw slavery, and we had to fight a war over it, the Civil War. And that's when slavery was outlawed in the United States. Slavery even continues as an institutional practice throughout the world today. I don't know if you knew that or not. It's still going on. But for us, the question as Christians is, does the Bible condone slavery? And that's an interesting way to word that because of this word here, condone. There are two words here, and both of them meant something different when the Bible was written over 2,000 years ago than they do today. The first one is condone. You ever used the word condone? You ever said this phrase? Well, I don't condone their behavior, but. As soon as you say but, you've just condoned their behavior. Condone has come to mean favor or approve of their behavior, but that's not its original intention. Originally, condone meant to regard or treat something bad or blameworthy as acceptable, forgivable, or harmless. Well, does the Bible speak that way about slavery? We're going to look at some key points about slavery in the Bible, and there's actually two different categories, because the way that the Old Testament looked at slavery is different in the Old Testament than it is in the New Testament, and both of them are different from how we view slavery today. Slavery from an American mindset is basically perpetual enslavement, where you are under the thumb of a master and forced to do difficult and harmful work all day, every day, your entire life long, and that there's no escaping it. That's actually what's known as chattel slavery, or the class of being born into perpetual slavery. But slavery is much larger than that, as an institution and as a philosophical concept. So what does it say? Exodus 21:16, it says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death." This is the laws concerning slavery in the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, going back to 1446 BC, Exodus 21. First point, Forced slavery among Israelites was a capital offense. I'll say that again. It was a capital offense to enslave and sell anyone, to put them into forced servitude, forced slavery. Does this sound like it's condoning slavery? If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a forced slave or a perpetual slave. Leviticus 25:39. What is this? For Israel, Israelites were voluntary debt slaves. Debt slaves. How is that different?
Quicksilver gives you unlimited 1.5% cash back on every purchase every day and makes it easy for you to redeem your rewards. Unlimited and easy. What else do you need to know? You tell me. What's in your wallet?
Debt slaves. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Let's say that you had a bad crop one year and you couldn't afford to pay your bills, so you borrowed money from your neighbor to get your crop in the next year. I mean, everyone was basically farmers. It was an agrarian society. What if it happens 2 years in a row? Now suddenly you have no money and you have none of your neighbor's money. What can you possibly do? You could sell your only asset, yourself, and go and work on your neighbor's farm and be under their care, where you would get food and clothing, basically like an indentured servant. That's what it was, in order to pay off, to service the debt that you owed. It's no different than the way, it's no different in logic in the way that you get a mortgage to pay for a house, or you get a credit card and you put money on that credit card. Whatever debt you accrue, you spend your time servicing that debt. Now, thankfully, you have enough to also pay your other bills, but that's what you're doing. And what happens if you don't pay that debt? You default on it and you become more poor rather than less poor. It's the same way of thinking before there were credit cards or even banks that allowed lending at interest, which in the Bible actually speaks negatively about. In Israel, there was no interest on this. This is how you paid your debt. You became an indentured servant to your neighbor. You became a debt slave. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in your town, wherever it suits him, in the place that he shall choose. You don't choose for him. Finally, you shall not wrong him, from Deuteronomy 23. What does this mean? It means Israel was to be considered a sanctuary for all slaves. That's the first point. See, God had chosen Israel and brought them out of slavery, perpetual slavery, chattel slavery, into the promised land. How do you think God feels about slavery? Just from that event alone, the most important event which defines the Old Testament as the Old Testament. That's the heart of it, is God delivering Israel out of bondage. And so Israel was designed by God to be a place of sanctuary for slaves. But interestingly, this also points out something else, this verse. As a debt slave, if you get tired of paying your debt, you just walk away from the contract. You would be seen as someone who was unreliable and not someone to lend money to, but you weren't forced into bondage. You leave, no one else was allowed to take you back to your master. You were allowed to be free wherever you laid your head. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing, from Exodus 21. So debt slavery, whatever form of slavery, if you were a fellow Israelite, you were set free after 6 years. This was the law in order to make sure that the one who lended you money would get a decent return on their investment, that you would go and serve for 6 years. But as I mentioned before, this would be an end to your debt. As the slave, you could end it any time you wanted to by leaving. And you shall, and this is really interesting, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan, from Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. Regardless of whether you were a debt slave or a perpetual slave, born into slavery, every 50 years, all slaves were free. As law, according to God, given to the Israelites, the year of Jubilee, all slaves were freed, regardless of circumstances or status. The only thing that would overturn this is if the slave said, no, I want to stay with my master. So, in the Old Testament, slavery as we understand it was very different from our modern understanding of permanent slavery. And so when you look at that, it doesn't seem like God was a big fan of slavery. God was limiting slavery wherever it showed up. And the way Israel lived was very different from the rest of the ancient civilizations around them. More of them were like what was going on in the New Testament when Israel's laws was no longer the law of the land. The law of the land was the law of the Roman Empire. And so the way that the New Testament authors dealt with slavery is different than the way that the law lays out the regulations of slavery. So here are key points about slavery in the New Testament. Point number 1, how do you become a slave in Rome? When in Rome, do as the Romans. First of all, through debts. Just like in the Old Testament, you accrue debts. You go and you serve your master who you took the debts from by law. The thing about it, though, in the New Testament under Rome, when you go and work for the master to pay off your debts to them, you could accrue more debts because they could charge you for room and board and all those things as well. So debt slavery could be a slippery slope, very much like accruing credit card debt can be a slippery slope, right? The second way is to be captured in war. The primary ideal of the United States is liberty or freedom. That's what our country was founded on, and it took us a civil war to actually carry out that ideal. Being a nation founded on freedom and yet having slavery necessarily had to come to an end, and it did with the Civil War, so that we would actually live up to our ideals. The primary ideal of Rome is the term Nike. It's where we get those shoes. It means victory. Victory was a primary ideal, and the way that you moved up in the echelons of Rome was really through conquering other nations, other civilizations around Rome. And so they would go and they would capture land, and the people of that land became slaves. They became slaves of war and were captured and brought back. They ended up becoming slaves of the general and the army and were brought back into Roman provinces and sold into slavery that way. The third way was to be born a slave, actually as a separate class. In Rome, it was a class system, the lowest class being slaves. Really, it was slaves of slaves, because slaves could own slaves too in Rome. They were open to everybody. And the highest would be the emperor and the royal family. But you would fall into this caste system, and one of the goals was to move up. That's the victory part of Rome, was to move up in your class system through work, through military means, through cunning, whatever it may be. But you could become a slave through owning debts, being captured in war, or being born a slave. Point number 2, slave was not based on race. In fact, in the ancient world, they didn't care what your background was, what your skin color was. It was completely normal, and more so to see slaves in Rome who had blonde hair and blue eyes coming from the Germanic states, what was called Gaul at the time, and the Germanic tribes, because that's who they were warring with the most when the Bible was being written. And so it wasn't based on skin color like it was in the United States. Slavery was open to everybody, and everybody could become a slave, including many very prominent people that we have their writings in history who spoke of their time of being a slave, because slavery was often temporary. You would sell yourself into slavery to try to get into a better class or a better station in life, especially if you were down on your luck or you were poor. But slavery did not mean just digging ditches or menial labor. You could be a slave who was a teacher or an artisan or a painter or a professional or a doctor. There were even senators in the government that were slaves to someone else. Slavery meant you served the will of your master, which really is what the heart of slavery is. Whether you choose to or don't, you're serving someone else's will. You're carrying out their will, not your own. It says, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, from 1 Timothy 1:10. How do the religious writers, the Christian writers, the apostles respond to the reality of slavery in a land that they had no authority or power to overturn? See, some people get angry at the Bible and say, well, why did God allow slavery? It's not like that. It's a bit more complicated than that, and understanding the context can help you understand why the Bible speaks the way that it does. Here, in 1 Timothy, slavery as a practice is condemned. All the things that were named there in Timothy's letter by Paul is a vice list of behavior to be avoided, and being an enslaver is one of them. These are people who need the gospel because they are condemned for their behavior, and without it, will receive eternal punishment. That's the point that Paul is bringing forth. And here, slavery as a practice is condemned. The biggest one, though, comes from the judgment. Revelation 18, verse 13. Here in Revelation, the world has been judged, and the greatest world power has been judged, Babylon the harlot, or Babylon the Great. And this is the funeral. This text is from the funeral of Babylon, who's being judged by God. The wrath of God has been poured out of her. There's actually 2 crimes that she's committed, but here is the lament of one of 3 categories of people that come to mourn Babylon the Great. The first group are the kings, the second group are the seafarers, and the third group is the merchants. And they are mourning her because no one will buy their stuff anymore. There's 2 crimes against her. The first crime is she has the blood of the saints on her hands for killing Christians, just for being Christian. The second one is revealed here. No more are they buying our cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves. That is human souls. What was the crime against Babylon? Why she deserved God's wrath? Murder and slavery. The slave trade is condemned here. Does the Bible condone slavery? But it goes more so. How does God then work to undermine slavery if in the Old Testament God could limit it? In the New Testament, there's no power to limit slavery in Rome. What can the apostles in the early Christian church do? 100 years beforehand, there was a guy named Spartacus. Remember his name? Great movie, I Am Spartacus. He led an insurrection in Rome 100 years before the events of the Bible and was completely stomped down by a guy named Julius Caesar. Slavery wasn't overturned by violent insurrection. Instead, it was crushed. So what does God do? He's going to do something else. Notice what it says here. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. And then Paul says, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself the opportunity, from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. What's going on? Freedom from slavery is encouraged in the New Testament. Here Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you can't overthrow the institution of slavery by going outside in, by overthrowing it by power, you got to go inside out. See, Jesus didn't come to overthrow the institution of slavery. Jesus came to overthrow your enslavers, the true enslavers from which every outward expression finds its design. We're talking about the slavery of sin, of death, and the power of the devil. Those who truly enslave you and subjugate you to their will. They need to be overthrown. Jesus isn't coming just to overturn the bad stuff that's done in the world because the world is broken. He comes to fix the problem, which is broken hearts that are enslaved to sin, death, and the devil. They need to be emancipated first. And when people are emancipated, the institutions crumble and dissolve on their own. Why do you think it took so long for Christians to be able to be in a place to overturn institutions like slavery? It took 1,800 years before the first nation overturned the entire practice of slavery from the time of the Bible. Because hearts have to be changed before the institution can be overthrown. Because even if you overthrew the institution, the heart of it, the desire, the original sin of wanting to be our own gods, to subjugate everyone else around us to our will so that our will be done, continues. Instead, something else needs to be done. God needs to break in to set people free from sin, death, and the devil, to be truly free. It goes on. Here there is no Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all and in all. When Jesus Christ breaks in on you, when the gospel emancipates you from the inside out, you realize two things. One, we are all sinners and all in the same boat. No one is better than someone else. We are all in slavery to sin, death, and the devil. And two, Jesus Christ is the only one who can set us free. And in setting us free, there are not multiple races of people or multiple categories of people, but there is only one race, the human race. We are all made in the image of God, image bearers of God, and set free on account of Jesus Christ, not to be masters to others, but rather to be slaves to Christ, because his will becomes our will. That's what slavery is, really. It's following your master's will. But this becomes a want to rather than a have to, because Christ sets us free. He emancipates us from the inside out. And when we're emancipated from the inside out, no matter our circumstances in life, we are free. Regardless of your circumstances in this life, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, you are free. And that freedom continues for eternity. Not a freedom from God, but a freedom from your true oppressors, sin, death, and the devil, so that you become in a right relationship with God. Maybe this will help us understand what Paul is saying when he says slaves. The word is doulos. It also means servants. Obey your earthly masters. That word is kurios. It means Lord. With fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. See? Your will becomes a want to rather than a have to. Rendering service or slavery with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Now, anyone reading this in Rome would have been like, yeah, tell those slaves to stay in their place. Tell them to be good servants. That's what they should be, especially if they're following Jesus. But here's the real radical part. What does Paul say next? Masters, do the same to them. Become slaves to your slaves. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. All are equal in his eyes. So what's going on? The gospel is working inside out. So I ask you this question. Does the Bible condone slavery? You decide. What I have for you is a promise that works inside out, that emancipates. That promise is the gospel. Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sake. He has overcome sin, death, and the devil for you. All of your sins are forgiven in his name. Amen.